In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield as Master Sergeant Jake Morrison walked slowly around the damaged AH-64 Apache helicopter. His weathered hands traced the twisted metal where shrapnel had torn through the fuselage during the last mission over hostile territory. The aircraft sat like a wounded bird, its rotors drooping and engine compartments blackened from fire damage. "She's done for." "Sergeant," called out Lieutenant Colonel Richards, the base commander, as he approached with a clipboard full of paperwork. "The damage assessment team has been over every inch of this bird. The main rotor assembly is cracked. The transmission housing is compromised and half the avionics are fried. We're looking at a total loss." Morrison didn't respond immediately. He continued his inspection, running his fingers along stress fractures that spiderwebbed through the aircraft's skin. At 62 years old, he had seen more helicopters than most people had seen cars. His gray hair was cropped military short, and his blue eyes held the kind of intensity that came from 3 decades of keeping flying machines in the air. The replacement cost alone would be $35 million, Richards continued, consulting his papers. "Add in the repair estimates, and we're talking about throwing good money after bad. The Pentagon has already approved the write-off. She'll be stripped for parts and sent to the boneyard by the end of the week." Other mechanics had gathered around, watching the exchange with interest. They respected Morrison, but they also knew the realities of military budgets and bureaucracy. When the brass said a machine was beyond repair, it usually stayed that way. The Apache had been their pride and joy, one of the most advanced attack helicopters in the world, but even the best technology had its limits. Morrison finally straightened up and looked directly at the colonel. "Sir, with respect, I think they're wrong." His voice was steady and calm, the tone of a man who had learned to choose his words carefully over decades of military service. "I've been working on rotorcraft since before some of these boys were born. This bird can fly again." The colonel's eyebrows rose slightly. He had always respected Morrison's expertise, but the old sergeant was talking about salvaging something that 3 different engineering teams had declared hopeless. "Jake, I appreciate your confidence, but the damage assessment was thorough. We're not talking about a routine maintenance issue here. This aircraft took direct hits from rocket-propelled grenades." "I know what she took," Morrison replied quietly. "I was here when they brought her in. I watched the crew climb out shaken but alive because this machine protected them even when she was falling apart." "That means something." He paused, looking back at the helicopter. "Give me 2 weeks and a small team. If I can't show you significant progress, then send her to the scrap heap." The younger mechanics exchanged glances. They had heard stories about Morrison's legendary repairs, but this seemed like an impossible task even for him. The Apache looked like it had been through a war zone, which it had. Bullet holes peppered the cockpit area, and hydraulic fluid had stained the concrete beneath the aircraft in dark, spreading pools. Richard studied Morrison's face, seeing the determination there. The sergeant had never been one to make promises he couldn't keep. During his career, he had pulled off some remarkable resurrections of damaged aircraft, earning him a reputation that extended far beyond their base. Still, this was different. This was a machine that qualified engineers had declared beyond salvation. "The parts alone would cost more than my annual budget," Richard said, though his tone had softened slightly. "And even if you could source everything needed, the labor hours would be astronomical." "We're not running a charity here, Jake." Morrison nodded slowly. "I understand the constraints, sir. But what if I could do it with salvaged parts and minimal new components? What if the labor was mostly volunteer time from people who believe in what we're doing here?" He gestured toward the other mechanics, some of whom were already looking intrigued despite themselves. The base had been facing budget cuts and morale issues. Several experienced personnel had been transferred to other installations, and the remaining crew had been working longer hours with fewer resources. The sight of the damaged Apache had become a daily reminder of their limitations, a symbol of what they couldn't accomplish rather than what they could. "You're talking about a miracle, Sergeant," Richard said, but there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely dismissive of the idea. "Even if you could repair the structural damage, the electronics alone would require specialized equipment we don't have access to." Morrison smiled for the first time that morning. Sir, I've been working miracles for 30 years. Sometimes the only difference between impossible and inevitable is having the right person ask for the right tools. He looked directly at the colonel. All I need is permission to try, and maybe someone could find me a good wrench to start with. The request was so simple, so understated, that it caught everyone off guard. Here was a man asking to attempt the impossible, and all he wanted was basic hand tools and the freedom to begin. The contrast between the magnitude of the challenge and the modesty of his requirement somehow made the whole proposition seem more credible rather than less. Richards found himself considering options he hadn't thought possible just minutes earlier. Morrison's confidence was infectious, and the colonel remembered other times when the old sergeant had accomplished things that seemed unlikely at best. More importantly, he recognized that his personnel needed something to believe in, a project that could restore their sense of purpose and capability. 2 weeks, Richards said finally. But I want daily progress reports, and if this starts looking like a waste of time and resources, we pull the plug immediately. He paused, looking around at the assembled mechanics who were now hanging on every word. And Jake? You better be right about this, because if you fail, it's not just your reputation on the line. Morrison extended his hand to shake on the agreement. Understood, sir. Just get me that wrench. Aving Whiskers' content and purring in the sun. News of Morrison's bold promise spread through the base like wildfire. By evening, mechanics from different squadrons were finding excuses to walk past the damaged Apache, studying it with new eyes. The helicopter that had been written off that morning was suddenly the center of intense speculation and debate. Some called Morrison crazy, others called him brave, but everyone was talking. Corporal Maria Santos was the first to approach Morrison the next morning. She found him already at work, having arrived before dawn to begin his impossible task. He was lying on his back beneath the aircraft, flashlight in hand, examining the transmission housing that everyone said was beyond repair. Sergeant Morrison, she called out tentatively, I heard about what you're trying to do. I was wondering if you could use some help. Morrison slid out from under the helicopter, his uniform already stained with hydraulic fluid and grease. Santos was one of the younger mechanics fresh out of technical school, but she had shown real aptitude for electronics and avionics systems. What do you think, Santos? Think this old bird can fly again? Honestly, sir, I don't know, she replied, looking up at the damaged aircraft. But I know you've done things that other people said were impossible, and I figure I might learn something working with you even if we don't succeed. By the end of the first day, 3 more mechanics had volunteered their off-duty time to the project. Word had also reached the other branches of service stationed at the base. Staff Sergeant Tommy Chen from the Air Force offered his expertise with radar systems, and a Navy electronics specialist named Petty Officer Rodriguez volunteered to help with the communication equipment. Morrison organized his volunteers into specialized teams. He assigned Santos to work on the avionics bay, where damaged circuit boards and severed wiring harnesses created a maze of technical challenges. Chen would focus on the radar and targeting systems, while Rodriguez tackled the communication array that had been partially destroyed by shrapnel. The structural repair team consisted of 3 experienced mechanics who understood welding, metalwork, and composite materials. Morrison led this group personally, knowing that without a sound airframe, all the electronic repairs in the world wouldn't matter. They started by carefully cutting away the most severely damaged sections, revealing the extent of the internal destruction. Jesus, muttered Sergeant Williams, one of the structural specialists, as they exposed the main transmission area. It looks like someone took a sledgehammer to the gear train. The transmission housing showed multiple stress fractures, and several critical components had been shattered by the impact of enemy fire. Morrison studied the damage with the calm patience of a surgeon examining a complex case. It's not as bad as it looks, he said, though privately he was beginning to understand why the assessment teams had been so pessimistic. We can fabricate replacement parts for most of this. The real question is whether we can do it with the resources we have available. The first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While searching through the base's supply warehouse for usable parts, Santos discovered several crates of components that had been ordered for a different helicopter model but never installed. The parts weren't exact matches, but with some modification, they could serve as the foundation for rebuilding the Apache's damaged systems. This is like finding buried treasure, she told Morrison excitedly, as they inventoried the unexpected windfall. These circuit boards are 2 generations newer than what was originally installed. If we can adapt them to work with the Apache's architecture, we might actually end up with better performance than before. Morrison smiled at her enthusiasm. He had seen the same excitement in young mechanics throughout his career, the joy of discovery that made long hours and difficult challenges worthwhile. That's the spirit, Santos. Sometimes the best repairs come from making something better than it was originally. The word about their salvaged components spread quickly, and soon other units were offering their own surplus materials. The project was becoming a base-wide effort, with people contributing everything from spare wiring to specialized tools. Even the kitchen staff began staying open later to feed the volunteers who were working through their normal mealtimes. But not everyone was supportive. Major Harrison from the finance office visited the worksite on the 3rd day, clearly concerned about the resources being devoted to what he considered a futile exercise. "Sergeant Morrison, I understand your enthusiasm, but we need to be realistic about what's achievable here. The man-hours alone are adding up to significant costs." Morrison straightened up from where he was installing a rebuilt gear assembly. "Sir, every hour being spent on this project is volunteer time. Nobody's being paid overtime, and most of the parts we're using were headed for disposal anyway. We're actually saving money by keeping materials out of the waste stream." "That's not the point," Harrison replied stiffly. "These people have regular duties that might be suffering while they're focused on this pet project. And what happens when you fail? What kind of message does that send about our capabilities?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison was aware that several of his volunteers had stopped working to listen to the exchange. He chose his words carefully, knowing that his response would affect not just his own credibility but the morale of everyone involved in the effort. "Major, with respect, we haven't failed yet," Morrison said calmly. "And as for regular duties, I think you'll find that the people working on this project are more motivated and engaged than they've been in months. Sometimes the best thing you can do for morale is give people a chance to be part of something meaningful." Harrison looked around at the worksite, taking in the sight of personnel from different branches collaborating on a common goal. Despite his skepticism about the project's chances of success, he couldn't deny that the base had felt more energetic and focused since Morrison had begun his repair effort. After the major left, Santos approached Morrison with a concerned expression. "Do you really think we can pull this off, Sergeant? I mean, every day we find new problems, new things that need to be replaced or rebuilt. Sometimes it feels like we're trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle when half the pieces are missing." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, Santos. This is the hardest repair I've ever attempted. But here's what I've learned in 30 years of fixing broken machines. If you focus on what's impossible, you'll never accomplish what's difficult. We just have to take it one problem at a time, one component at a time." He gestured toward the Apache, which was beginning to look less like a casualty and more like a patient in recovery. "Look at what we've accomplished in just 3 days. The transmission housing is repaired. We've replaced 60% of the damaged wiring. And Chen has the radar system responding to basic commands. 6 months from now, this bird could be protecting crews again instead of sitting in a scrapyard." As the first week of the project concluded, Morrison compiled his daily report for Colonel Richards. The progress was real but incremental, the kind of steady advancement that looked impressive on paper but still left them far from their ultimate goal. He knew that skeptics would point out how much work remained, but he also knew that his team was learning and improving with each challenge they overcame. The real test would come in the second week, when they would attempt to integrate all their repaired systems and discover whether their patchwork of solutions could function as a cohesive whole. The second week began with a crisis that threatened to end Morrison's ambitious project before it could reach completion. During a routine inspection, Staff Sergeant Chen discovered hairline fractures in the main rotor hub, the critical component that connected the rotor blades to the aircraft's drive system. The damage had been hidden beneath layers of grime and hadn't been detected in the initial assessment. "This changes everything," Chen told Morrison grimly as they examined the fractures under high-powered worklights. "The rotor hub is the heart of the whole system. If it fails in flight, there's no emergency landing, no auto-rotation, nothing. The aircraft just falls out of the sky." Morrison studied the damage through a magnifying glass, his expression grave. The fractures were subtle but unmistakable, stress lines that indicated the metal had been pushed beyond its design limits during the helicopter's violent emergency landing. Replacing the rotor hub would require specialized equipment and parts that simply weren't available on their base. How long would it take to get a replacement hub? Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Minimum 6 months, probably longer, Chen replied. And that's assuming we could get authorization for the expense. We're talking about a component that costs more than most people's houses. The news spread quickly through Morrison's volunteer team, and the mood shifted from cautious optimism to resignation. Several mechanics who had been working enthusiastically on other aspects of the repair began questioning whether they should continue. If the rotor hub was indeed beyond salvation, all their other efforts would be meaningless. Santos found Morrison alone with the helicopter that evening, long after the rest of the team had gone home. He was sitting on a work stool, staring up at the damaged rotor assembly with the intensity of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle through sheer force of will. "Sergeant, maybe it's time to admit that some things really are beyond repair," she said gently. "You gave it your best shot, and you've accomplished more than anyone thought possible. There's no shame in accepting that we've hit a wall we can't get past." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, then stood up and walked over to a workbench where he kept his tools. He picked up a well-worn wrench, the same type of basic tool he had requested when he first asked for permission to attempt the repair. The wrench was old and scarred from decades of use, but it was still perfectly functional. "Santos, let me tell you about the first helicopter I ever worked on," he said, turning the wrench over in his hands. It was a UH-1 Huey that had crashed during a training exercise. The entire tail boom was twisted, the transmission was seized, and the engine had thrown a rod through the block. Every expert who looked at it said the same thing: write it off and order a replacement. He set the wrench down and looked directly at her. But my old sergeant, a guy named Murphy who had been fixing helicopters since Vietnam, he saw something different. He said that every machine has a soul, a fundamental integrity that goes beyond just the sum of its parts. If you can find that soul and work with it instead of against it, sometimes you can accomplish things that don't make sense on paper. Santos listened intently, drawn in despite her skepticism. "What happened to the Huey?" "We spent 4 months rebuilding it from the ground up," Morrison continued. "We fabricated parts that weren't supposed to be fabricable, we repaired things that weren't supposed to be repairable, and we made that helicopter better than it had ever been. It flew for another 15 years after that, and it never had a major mechanical failure." He picked up the wrench again, testing its weight in his hand. "The rotor hub on this Apache is cracked, but it's not broken. The metal is still there. The basic structure is still sound. What if instead of trying to replace it, we figured out how to strengthen it?" Santos frowned, trying to understand what he was suggesting. "Strengthen it how? You can't just weld over stress fractures in high-stress components. The repair would fail the first time the aircraft encountered turbulence." Morrison smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since the rotor hub problem was discovered. "You're thinking like an engineer, Santos, which is good most of the time. But sometimes you have to think like an artist. What if we could redistribute the stress? Create a new load path that bypasses the damaged areas entirely." Over the next 3 days, Morrison worked with Chen and Rodriguez to develop a radical solution to the rotor hub problem. Instead of trying to repair the existing fractures, they would create a secondary support structure that would carry the critical loads through undamaged portions of the hub assembly. The modification would require precision machining and careful calculation, but it could be accomplished with the tools and materials they had available. "It's crazy enough that it might actually work," Rodriguez admitted, as they reviewed Morrison's hand-drawn blueprints. "But if we're wrong, if the stress calculations are off by even a small margin, we could be signing someone's death warrant." Morrison nodded soberly. "That's why we're going to test everything twice, measure everything 3 times, and build in safety margins that would make a structural engineer proud. We're not just fixing this machine, we're making it safe enough to trust with human lives." The modification work required skills and precision that pushed all of them to their limits. Morrison personally machined the custom support brackets, working with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Santos created new wiring harnesses to accommodate the modified hub assembly, while Chen developed a testing protocol that would verify the integrity of their repair under simulated flight conditions. Word of their innovative solution spread beyond the base, attracting attention from engineering experts at the helicopter manufacturer. Dr. Sarah Kim, a senior design engineer, arrived on the base on Friday afternoon to review Morrison's modifications and assess their viability. "This is highly irregular," Dr. Kim said as she examined the modified rotor hub. "The original design went through years of testing and certification. What you're proposing is essentially a new configuration that hasn't been validated according to standard procedures." Morrison met her gaze steadily. "Ma'am, with respect, standard procedures declared this aircraft unrepairable. Sometimes you have to go beyond standard procedures to find solutions that actually work." Dr. Kim spent several hours reviewing the modifications, checking calculations and asking detailed questions about the repair methodology. Despite her initial skepticism, she found herself impressed by the thoroughness and ingenuity of Morrison's approach. The old sergeant had essentially redesigned a critical component using nothing more than practical experience and intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. "I have to admit, this is some of the most creative engineering I've seen in years," she finally said. "The stress analysis looks sound, and the safety margins are actually better than the original design. If this were happening in our factory, we'd probably patent the modification." Her endorsement gave the project new credibility and momentum. Colonel Richards, who had been growing increasingly nervous about the scope and visibility of Morrison's repair effort, began to see it as a potential showcase for the base's capabilities, rather than a risky experiment that could damage his reputation. By the end of the second week, the Apache was beginning to look like a functional aircraft again. The structural repairs were complete, the avionics systems were responding normally, and the modified rotor hub was ready for its first operational test. Morrison compiled his final progress report, knowing that the real test would come when they attempted to bring the helicopter's engines online for the first time since the crash. Monday morning of the third week brought an unusual gathering to the helicopter maintenance hangar. Word had spread throughout the base, and beyond that, Morrison's team was ready to attempt their first engine start. Colonel Richards was present, along with Dr. Kim from the manufacturer, several visiting officers from other installations, and virtually every mechanic and technician who could find a reason to be there. Morrison stood beside the Apache, running through his final pre-start checklist with the methodical precision that had characterized his entire approach to the project. The helicopter looked dramatically different from the wreckage that had been written off 3 weeks earlier. Fresh paint covered the repaired sections, new components gleamed under the hangar lights, and the modified rotor hub assembly showed the careful craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. "All right, people, let's make some noise," Morrison announced to his team as they took their positions around the aircraft. Santos was stationed at the avionics console, monitoring the electronic systems that she had painstakingly rebuilt. Chen manned the radar and targeting displays, while Rodriguez watched the communication equipment that had been completely reconstructed from salvaged parts. The first engine started with a low whine that gradually built to the familiar turbine roar that every helicopter mechanic knew by heart. Morrison watched the gauges carefully, looking for any indication of problems in the complex systems they had repaired and modified. Oil pressure, hydraulic pressure, transmission temperature, every parameter fell within normal operating ranges. "Engine 1 is stable and showing normal readings," Santos reported over the intercom. "All electrical systems are green across the board." Morrison nodded and moved to start the second engine. This was the power plant that had suffered the most damage during the emergency landing, and it had required the most extensive rebuilding. New turbine blades, rebuilt fuel controls, and a completely reconstructed exhaust system all had to work together flawlessly for the helicopter to be truly airworthy. The second engine caught immediately, spinning up to operating speed without hesitation. The sound of both engines running simultaneously filled the hangar with a powerful harmony that brought grins to the faces of everyone who had worked on the project. But Morrison knew that getting the engines running was only the first step in proving that their repair was truly successful. "We're going to run a complete systems check," he announced over the noise. "I want to exercise every component, every control surface, every electronic system, before we even think about leaving the ground." For the next hour, they put the Apache through an exhaustive series of tests. The rotor blades turned slowly at first, then faster as Morrison increased power, and verified that the modified hub assembly was functioning properly. The hydraulic systems cycled through their full range of motion, operating the flight controls and weapon systems with smooth precision. Dr. Kim watched the proceedings with growing amazement. She had seen factory acceptance tests for brand new helicopters that were less thorough than the evaluation Morrison was conducting. Every system was tested not just for basic function, but for performance under stress, response to emergency conditions, and integration with other aircraft systems. Targeting system is locked on and tracking normally, Chen reported as they tested the weapon systems. Radar is showing clear returns out to maximum range, and all defensive systems are responding to commands. Rodriguez added his confirmation. Communications are crystal clear on all frequencies. The encryption systems are functioning normally, and data links are established with base operations. The most critical test came when Morrison began to increase rotor speed toward the point where the aircraft would be capable of flight. The modified hub assembly would face its greatest stress at this point, and everyone in the hangar was aware that failure now could be catastrophic. The rotor speed increased gradually, passing through each critical threshold without any indication of problems. The new support structure that Morrison had designed was distributing loads exactly as calculated, and the stress monitoring equipment showed that all components were operating well within their design limits. "We're at flight-capable RPM," Morrison announced. "All systems are green, all temperatures and pressures are normal. This bird is ready to fly." A cheer went up from the assembled crowd, but Morrison held up his hand for quiet. "We've proven that our repairs work on the ground," he said. "But we're not done yet. The real test is whether this aircraft can perform its mission safely and reliably." Colonel Richards approached Morrison with a serious expression. "Jake, what you and your team have accomplished here is remarkable. But before this helicopter can return to active duty, it needs to pass a formal flight test evaluation. Are you prepared to take that step?" Morrison looked around at his team, seeing the mixture of pride and apprehension in their faces. They had accomplished something that experts had declared impossible, but they all knew that the ultimate validation would come only when the Apache returned to the sky under operational conditions. "Sir, we're ready for flight testing," Morrison replied confidently. "But I want to be the one flying the evaluation missions. If there are any problems with our repairs, I should be the one to face the consequences." Dr. Kim stepped forward. "Sergeant Morrison, I have to tell you that what you've accomplished here goes far beyond a simple repair job. You've essentially created a new variant of the Apache that incorporates design improvements we hadn't even considered. The manufacturer would be very interested in studying your modifications for possible incorporation into future production aircraft." The implications of her statement weren't lost on anyone present. If Morrison's innovations proved successful in flight testing, they could potentially benefit every Apache helicopter in service. What had started as a desperate attempt to save a single damaged aircraft could evolve into improvements that would enhance the safety and capability of the entire fleet. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Morrison said modestly. "First, we need to prove that this particular helicopter can do its job safely and effectively. Everything else is just speculation until we have real flight test data." But privately, Morrison felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond the technical achievement of completing the repair. He had given his team the opportunity to push beyond conventional limitations and discover what they were truly capable of accomplishing. The young mechanics who had volunteered for the project had learned lessons about persistence, innovation, and teamwork that would serve them throughout their careers. Santos approached Morrison as the crowd began to disperse. "Sergeant, when do you think we'll be ready for the first flight test?" Morrison smiled, looking up at the Apache that had been transformed from a write-off into a potentially superior aircraft. "Tomorrow morning, if the weather cooperates. After all we've been through, I don't see any point in waiting." He paused, then added, "Santos, I want you to be part of the flight test crew. You've earned the right to see this project through to completion." As the hangar emptied and the Apache was prepared for its overnight security, Morrison remained behind for a few minutes of quiet reflection. The helicopter that had been declared beyond repair 3 weeks earlier now stood ready to return to active service. But more importantly, a group of dedicated professionals had proven that with determination, creativity, and the right leadership, seemingly impossible challenges could be overcome. The old wrench that had started it all still lay on Morrison's workbench, a simple tool that had become a symbol of practical wisdom and hands-on expertise. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test of everything they had accomplished. But tonight, Morrison allowed himself to feel proud of what his team had achieved against all odds. Dawn broke clear and calm over the airfield. Perfect conditions for the Apache's first flight since its resurrection. Morrison arrived at the hangar before sunrise, wanting to conduct one final inspection before the official flight test began. He found Santos already there, running through her own pre-flight checklist with the thoroughness that had characterized her work throughout the project. "Couldn't sleep either?" Morrison asked as he began his walk-around inspection of the helicopter. "Too excited," Santos admitted. "I keep thinking about all the things that could go wrong, but I also keep thinking about how amazing it will be if everything goes right." Morrison nodded, understanding her mixture of anxiety and anticipation. He had experienced the same emotions before every first flight of a major repair project, but this one felt different. The stakes were higher, the technical challenges had been greater, and the level of scrutiny would be more intense than anything he had faced before. Chief Warrant Officer Linda Thompson, the test pilot who would be flying the evaluation mission, arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled departure time. She was known throughout the aviation community as one of the most skilled and demanding test pilots in the military, someone who would push the Apache to its limits while maintaining the highest safety standards. "Sergeant Morrison, I reviewed your modification reports and Dr. Kim's technical assessment," Thompson said as she began her own inspection of the aircraft. "I have to say this is some of the most innovative repair work I've ever seen. But you understand that I'm going to test every system and every component until I'm satisfied that this aircraft is completely airworthy." "I wouldn't want it any other way, ma'am," Morrison replied. "This helicopter has to be safe enough to protect crews in combat situations. If our repairs can't meet that standard, then we haven't really succeeded." Thompson spent an hour examining the aircraft, paying particular attention to the modified rotor hub assembly and the structural repairs that had been necessary after the combat damage. She questioned Morrison and his team about their repair procedures, testing protocols, and quality control measures with the detailed scrutiny of someone whose life would soon depend on their work. "All right, Sergeant, I'm satisfied with what I see here," Thompson finally announced. "Let's see how she performs in the air." The flight test began with basic airworthiness evaluations. Thompson lifted the Apache into a stable hover, checking the response of all flight controls and monitoring the performance of the modified rotor system. Morrison watched from the ground with binoculars, studying the helicopter's behavior for any signs of vibration, instability, or other problems that might indicate issues with their repairs. "All systems are responding normally," Thompson's voice crackled over the radio. "Control authority is excellent and the rotor system is running smoothly. I'm going to transition to forward flight and begin the performance evaluation." The Apache moved away from the airfield, climbing steadily as Thompson began a series of increasingly demanding maneuvers. She tested the helicopter's speed and agility, its ability to respond to sudden control inputs, and its performance under various load conditions. Each test was designed to stress the aircraft's systems and reveal any weaknesses that might not be apparent under normal operating conditions. From the ground, Morrison's team monitored the test through radio communications and data links that transmitted real-time information about the helicopter's performance. Santos watched the avionics displays, confirming that the electronic systems she had rebuilt were functioning flawlessly under operational conditions. Radar system is tracking multiple targets simultaneously, Chen reported as Thompson tested the aircraft's sensor capabilities. Resolution and range performance are actually better than the original specifications. Rodriguez added his confirmation. Communications are clear and strong on all frequencies. The encryption systems are working perfectly, and data transmission rates are exceeding design parameters. After 2 hours of comprehensive testing, Thompson returned the Apache to the airfield for the most critical evaluation of all, the weapons systems test. This would involve live fire exercises against ground targets, the ultimate proof that the helicopter could perform its intended combat mission safely and effectively. Ground control. This is Apache test flight requesting permission to proceed to the weapons range, Thompson transmitted as she prepared for the final phase of the evaluation. Apache test flight, you are cleared to the range. All safety protocols are in effect, and range control is standing by for your arrival, came the reply from the tower. Morrison and his team drove to the weapons range to observe the live fire tests. This was the moment that would validate or invalidate all their work. The proof that their repaired and modified Apache could deliver lethal firepower with the precision and reliability required in combat situations. Thompson began with the helicopter's 30mm chain gun, engaging a series of ground targets at various ranges and angles. The weapon system performed flawlessly, delivering accurate fire with no malfunctions or performance degradations. The targeting computer that Chen had rebuilt was providing precise fire control solutions, and the gun platform remained stable despite the recoil forces. Target engagement is successful, Thompson reported. Gun system is functioning normally, and accuracy is well within specifications. The final test involved the helicopter's missile systems, the most complex and demanding weapons carried by the Apache. Thompson selected targets at maximum range and launched a series of missiles that had to be guided to their targets by the rebuilt radar and targeting systems. Morrison watched through binoculars as the missiles streaked toward their targets, guided by the electronic systems that his team had painstakingly reconstructed from salvaged components. Each missile found its target with precision that exceeded the original performance specifications, demonstrating that their repairs had not only restored the helicopter's capabilities, but had actually enhanced them. All weapon systems are functioning at or above design specifications, Thompson announced as she completed the live fire phase of the evaluation. This aircraft is fully mission capable and ready for operational deployment. The words Morrison had hoped to hear for 3 weeks finally came through the radio, confirming that their impossible project had been successfully completed. The Apache that had been written off as beyond repair was now certified as mission-ready, validated by the most demanding tests that could be applied to a military helicopter. As Thompson brought the Apache back to the airfield for the final time, Morrison felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond personal or professional achievement. His team had proven that with determination, creativity, and skilled craftsmanship, even the most daunting technical challenges could be overcome. Santos approached Morrison as they watched the helicopter settle onto the landing pad. "Sergeant, I can't believe we actually did it. 3 weeks ago, this was just a pile of scrap metal, and now it's a fully operational combat aircraft." Morrison smiled, thinking about all the lessons learned and relationships forged during the intense project. "Santos, that's what happens when good people refuse to accept that something can't be done. Sometimes the difference between impossible and inevitable is just having the courage to ask for the right tools and the wisdom to use them properly." The successful flight test marked the end of one phase of the project, but Morrison knew it was also the beginning of something larger. The innovations they had developed would be studied and potentially implemented across the entire Apache fleet, and the team members who had contributed to the success would carry their new skills and confidence to future challenges. 3 days after the successful flight test, Morrison received word that his Apache project had attracted attention at the highest levels of military command. General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer responsible for all Army aviation maintenance, was flying in to personally inspect the helicopter and meet with the team that had accomplished what everyone else had deemed impossible. The general's visit brought a flurry of activity to the base. Colonel Richards ensured that every aspect of the maintenance operation was operating at peak efficiency, and Morrison's team prepared detailed presentations about their repair methods and innovations. The Apache itself was positioned prominently in the hangar, gleaming under special lighting that highlighted the quality of their workmanship. General Hayes arrived with a small entourage that included senior maintenance officers, engineering specialists, and a representative from the Department of Defense's Innovation Office. She was known throughout the military as a demanding leader who had little patience for anything less than excellence, but she was also recognized as someone who appreciated genuine achievement and innovative thinking. "Sergeant Morrison," General Hayes said as she approached the Apache, "I've read the technical reports about what you've accomplished here, but I wanted to see it for myself and hear directly from the people who made it happen." Morrison stood at attention, flanked by Santos, Chen, Rodriguez, and the other team members who had contributed to the project's success. "Ma'am, we're honored by your visit. This project succeeded because we had outstanding people willing to go beyond conventional approaches to find real solutions." The general spent the next hour examining every aspect of the repair work, asking detailed questions about methodology, quality control, and performance validation. She was particularly interested in the modified rotor hub assembly, recognizing that Morrison's innovation could have implications far beyond this single aircraft. "Sergeant, what you've created here isn't just a repair," General Hayes observed as she studied the technical drawings of the hub modification. "This is a design improvement that could enhance the safety and performance of every Apache in our inventory. Have you considered the broader applications of your work?" Morrison exchanged glances with Dr. Kim, who had remained on the base to document the modifications for potential fleet-wide implementation. "Ma'am, our focus was on saving this particular aircraft and proving that people shouldn't give up too quickly on complex challenges. But if our work can benefit other helicopters and other crews, then that makes everything we've done here even more worthwhile." General Hayes turned to address the entire team. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've accomplished here represents the best traditions of military maintenance and innovation. You've taken a problem that everyone else said was unsolvable, and you've not only solved it, but improved upon the original design in the process." Santos stepped forward slightly, her voice respectful but confident. "General, we learned that sometimes the most important tool isn't the most sophisticated one. Sergeant Morrison taught us that persistence, creativity, and teamwork can overcome almost any technical challenge if you're willing to think beyond conventional limitations." The general smiled, recognizing the leadership development that had occurred alongside the technical achievement. "Corporal Santos, that's a lesson that applies far beyond helicopter maintenance. The military needs people who can look at seemingly impossible situations and find ways to succeed, despite the obstacles." During her inspection, General Hayes announced several immediate changes that would result from Morrison's successful project. The modified rotor hub design would be evaluated for fleet-wide implementation, potentially improving the safety margins of hundreds of Apache helicopters. Morrison would be promoted to Master Sergeant and assigned to lead a new innovation team focused on developing creative solutions to complex maintenance challenges. "Furthermore," the general continued, "we're establishing a new program based on what you've accomplished here. The Morrison Protocol will be implemented at maintenance facilities throughout the military, giving experienced technicians the authority and resources to attempt innovative repairs on equipment that would otherwise be written off as total losses." The announcement stunned Morrison, who had never imagined that his simple request for permission to try fixing a broken helicopter would evolve into a program bearing his name. But as he thought about the implications, he realized that the real value wasn't in the recognition but in the opportunity to help other technicians and mechanics discover their own potential for creative problem-solving. Dr. Kim presented her final report on the project's technical innovations. The modifications had not only restored the Apache to full operational capability, but had actually improved its performance in several key areas. The rebuilt avionics systems were more reliable than the original components. The modified rotor hub provided better safety margins, and the overall aircraft was now more maintainable than when it had first rolled off the production line. This project demonstrates that field maintenance personnel, when given the proper support and freedom to innovate, can achieve results that rival or exceed those of formal engineering development programs, Dr. Kim concluded. The combination of practical experience, hands-on expertise, and creative thinking produced solutions that we hadn't considered in our laboratory environment. As the formal presentations concluded, General Hayes requested a private conversation with Morrison. They walked to a quiet corner of the hangar where they could speak without being overheard by the rest of the group. "Jake, I have to ask you something," the general said, dropping the formal tone she had maintained during the official proceedings. "When you first asked for permission to attempt this repair, did you really believe you could succeed, or were you just unwilling to accept defeat?" Morrison considered the question carefully before responding. "Ma'am, honestly, I wasn't sure we could pull it off. The damage was more extensive than anything I'd tackled before, and we didn't have access to the resources that would normally be required for this kind of work. But I knew that if we didn't try, we'd definitely fail, and I thought that was worse than the possibility of trying and coming up short." General Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "That's the kind of attitude we need more of throughout the military. Too often people accept limitations without really testing whether those limitations are real or just perceived." She paused, looking at the Apache that had been transformed from a casualty into a showcase of innovation. What you've proven here is that the most important tool isn't always the most complex one. Sometimes it really is just a matter of having the right person ask for a wrench and the freedom to use it. The general's visit concluded with a ceremony recognizing all the team members who had contributed to the project's success. Each volunteer received a commendation for their exceptional service, and Morrison was presented with a Special Achievement Award that acknowledged his leadership in developing innovative maintenance solutions. But for Morrison, the most meaningful recognition came from the young mechanics who had worked alongside him throughout the project. They had discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed, developed confidence in their ability to tackle complex challenges, and learned that with the right approach and sufficient determination, even the most daunting problems could be solved. As General Hayes prepared to depart, she made one final observation that would stay with Morrison for the rest of his career. "Sergeant, what you've really accomplished here isn't just fixing a helicopter. You've proven that American ingenuity and determination are still alive and well in the military. That's something we can't afford to lose. And it's something we need to cultivate in every unit and every installation." The Apache that had been written off as beyond repair was now scheduled to return to active duty within the week, carrying with it the innovations and improvements that had emerged from Morrison's refusal to accept conventional wisdom about what was possible. 6 months later, Morrison stood in a different hangar at a different base, watching a new team of mechanics work on another helicopter that had been declared beyond repair. The Morrison protocol had been implemented at 23 military installations, and the results were exceeding even the most optimistic projections. Aircraft that would have been scrapped were being returned to service, millions of dollars in replacement costs were being saved, and most importantly, maintenance personnel throughout the military were discovering new confidence in their abilities. The Apache that had started it all was now serving with distinction in a combat zone overseas. The crew that flew it had sent Morrison several messages describing how the helicopter's enhanced performance characteristics had helped them complete dangerous missions successfully. The modified rotor hub had proven itself under the most demanding conditions, and the rebuilt systems had operated flawlessly through hundreds of flight hours. Santos, now a sergeant herself, had been assigned to Morrison's innovation team and was leading her own project to repair a damaged Chinook helicopter that had been written off after a hard landing in mountainous terrain. She approached Morrison with a familiar look of determination mixed with uncertainty. "Master Sergeant, we've hit a snag with the Chinook project," she reported. "The rear rotor drive system is more damaged than we initially thought, and the engineering assessment says replacement would cost more than the aircraft is worth. Some people are suggesting we should just accept that this one really is beyond economic repair." Morrison set down the technical manual. He had been reading and looked at Santos with the same patient expression he had worn when she first volunteered to help with the Apache project. "What do you think, Santos? Have you personally examined the damage, or are you relying on someone else's assessment?" "I've looked at it, but the damage is really extensive," Santos admitted. "The drive shaft housing is cracked in multiple places, several gear teeth are sheared off, and the bearing assemblies are completely destroyed. It would require a complete rebuild of the entire drivetrain." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "So it's difficult but not impossible. The question is whether you and your team are willing to push beyond the conventional approach and find a creative solution." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "And whether you think you might need to ask for a wrench to get started." Santos grinned, recognizing the reference to the simple tool request that had begun Morrison's Apache project. "Actually, I was thinking more along the lines of a plasma cutter and some precision machine tools. But I get your point." Over the following weeks, Santos and her team applied the lessons they had learned from the Apache project to their new challenge. They discovered that the Chinook's drive system could be rebuilt using a combination of salvaged parts, innovative modifications, and custom fabricated components that improved upon the original design. The project took longer than the Apache repair had, but it ultimately succeeded in returning another aircraft to operational status. Morrison found himself traveling frequently, visiting bases where maintenance teams were implementing the Morrison protocol and attempting increasingly ambitious repair projects. Each installation brought its own unique challenges and opportunities, but the fundamental principles remained consistent. Experienced technicians with proper support and encouragement could accomplish far more than anyone expected. At one base in the Pacific, a team had successfully repaired a radar system that had been damaged by lightning, using creative rewiring techniques that actually improved the system's performance. At another installation, mechanics had rebuilt the transmission on a transport helicopter using parts cannibalized from 3 different aircraft, creating a hybrid system that was more reliable than any of the original configurations. But perhaps the most significant development was the change in attitude among maintenance personnel throughout the military. Where once there had been a tendency to accept manufacturer recommendations about write-offs and replacements, there was now a culture of questioning those assessments and exploring alternatives. Young mechanics were being encouraged to think creatively and propose innovative solutions. Knowing that their ideas would be taken seriously and given proper evaluation, Dr. Kim, who had become a strong advocate for the Field Innovation Program, published a comprehensive study documenting the technical and economic benefits of the Morrison Protocol. Her research showed that military maintenance operations were not only saving substantial amounts of money, but were also developing capabilities that enhanced overall readiness and effectiveness. What Master Sergeant Morrison started with his Apache project has evolved into something much larger. Dr. Kim explained in her presentation to a defense industry conference. We're seeing a renaissance of practical engineering and hands-on problem-solving that is producing innovations at a pace that formal research and development programs can't match. Morrison himself remained focused on the day-to-day work of mentoring maintenance teams and tackling challenging repair projects. He had been offered opportunities to move into administrative roles or formal engineering positions, but he preferred to stay close to the actual work of fixing broken machines and developing the next generation of innovative technicians. On a quiet Friday afternoon, Morrison received a package from overseas containing a simple item that brought back powerful memories. It was the original wrench he had used to begin the Apache project, returned by the crew that was now flying the helicopter in combat operations. Attached was a note that read, "Master Sergeant Morrison, this wrench has been with us through 27 combat missions. We figured it was time to send it home so you can use it to work more miracles. Thanks for proving that some things are never really beyond repair." Morrison held the worn tool in his hands, thinking about all the projects it had seen and all the people whose lives had been changed by the simple act of refusing to accept that something couldn't be fixed. The wrench looked exactly the same as it had 6 months earlier, but Morrison knew that its significance had grown far beyond its practical function. Santos found him in his office that evening, preparing for another trip to implement the Morrison Protocol at a new installation. "Master Sergeant, do you ever wonder what would have happened if Colonel Richards had said no when you asked for permission to work on the Apache?" Morrison looked up from his travel preparations, considering the question. "I suppose someone else would have figured out eventually that we were giving up too easily on complex problems. But I'm glad it worked out the way it did, because we've proven something important, that the most sophisticated technology in the world still depends on people who are willing to get their hands dirty and refuse to accept that something can't be done." He held up the returned wrench, its surface reflecting the office lights. "This old tool has been part of saving millions of dollars worth of equipment and proving that American maintenance personnel are the best in the world. But more importantly, it's been part of showing people that they're capable of much more than they thought possible." As Morrison prepared for his next assignment, he reflected on how a simple request for basic tools had evolved into a military-wide program that was changing the way people approached complex technical challenges. The Apache that had been declared beyond repair was still flying combat missions, protected by innovations that had emerged from the refusal to accept conventional limitations. The legacy of that project would continue long after Morrison retired, carried forward by the mechanics and technicians who had learned that with determination, creativity, and the right leadership, even the most daunting problems could be solved. Sometimes it really was just a matter of having the courage to ask for a wrench and the wisdom to use it properly.